It's been a short but tumultuous session, winter session in Parliament this time round, dominated by a lot of questions and few answers on what exactly is happening between India and China. One of the members of Parliament who have raised this issue vociferously time and again is Mr. Manish Tiwari. He's a Lok Sabha MP of the Congress Party, former Union Minister. He's joining me now on the show. Mr. Tiwari, thank you so much for speaking with us on Beyond the Headline. I want to first talk about the position you've taken, the questions you've raised, and you've tweeted this out as well, where you've referred to official statements and yet continue to ask questions on what exactly is happening between India and China. Now, I want to understand what those concerns are and why you have not found satisfactory the answers that have been given by the government in Parliament.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. If you were to rewind back to 2012, ever since Xi Jinping became the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and subsequently the President of the Republic of China, you have an unfortunate situation whereby there has been a general belligerence and aggressiveness in the Chinese position vis its neighbors. So therefore, it is not only on the line of actual control that you see tension, but there has been increased tensions in the South China Sea, China's claims along its 9-dash line, the building of artificial islands in the South China Sea, their claims vis Japan in the East China Sea with regard to Senkaku Islands, the surreptitious land grab which has been taking place in Bhutan, and of course tensions on the LAC which have now been persisting since the April of 2020. So therefore, what we had demanded, or rather I had demanded, of course supported by the Congress Party, was that there has to be a broader discussion as to what really is our read on the Chinese intentions. Why are the Chinese being so aggressive and belligerent, especially when we have agreements in place, the 1993 agreement, then the 2012 agreement, the 1996 agreement, whereby we had agreed to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. Why has China reneged on these commitments? And so therefore, where do we stand vis all these questions, especially when there's a seeming contradiction, because on one hand, you find that trade with China has actually gone up since the April of 2020, and of course the balance of trade being adverse against India. And then you have this tautness on the border. So therefore the intent, as I've earlier explained and pointed out and enunciated repeatedly, is not to finger point at the government. We are aware that it's a difficult situation, and so therefore under those circumstances we felt that Parliament should have been taken into confidence by the government.
So the response, Mr. Tiwari, from the BJP, those in the government, has been that the Congress Party's position on the recent scuffle between India and China is anti-India. They have quoted time and again Mr. Rahul Gandhi's statement, and the External Affairs Minister in fact stood up in Parliament and said you should have not used the word pitai for the Jawans. How do you respond to this? That questions being put forward by the Congress Party, by the opposition on China, and the expectations of very clear answers is anti-national.
Well, that's a laughable deflection, to put it very mildly. Because if you were to rewind to the history of democratic nations, and I can take you as far back as World War I, that when World War I and World War II were playing themselves out, across the democratic spectrum, parliaments were kept in loop by whichever was the government. And then if you were to come to 1962, when the border war between India and China was taking place, Parliament, at the insistence of late Prime Minister Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, or Prime Minister late Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, both in the Lok Sabha and the Raj Sabha, had an extremely extensive discussion from the 7th to the 15th of November 1962. In the Lok Sabha, 165 members participated. An equal number of members may have participated in the Raj Sabha also. And then again, during the 1971 war, when we liberated East Pakistan and redrew the map of South Asia, the winter session of Parliament was very much on, and Prime Minister late Mrs. Indira Gandhi and Defence Minister late Shri Jagjeevan Ram, kept Parliament on the loop in the loop with regard to the progress of that war, and it doesn't end there. Even when we were in a bit of a difficult situation with regard to the belligerence which was shown by Pakistan internationally on Jammu and Kashmir. In 1994, Parliament rose to the occasion and passed a unanimous resolution that they reiterated in 2012 that the only unfinished business of partition was the return of those territories illegally occupied by Pakistan. So, whenever it has come to the question of national security, discussions in Parliament have been very, very balanced, very sensible, mature, and constructive. So, therefore, under those circumstances, to try and deflect with inanities, for the lack of a better word, I think does not really show strength in part of the government. If I may put it in those words, it really reflects weakness.
But Mr. Tiwari, you have been in government. Clearly, when there are such sensitive issues, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, when there are such sensitive issues, everyone cannot be privy to that information. It could be against national security in some cases to make that information public. Many today would argue and ask that why does your party not just trust the Indian Armed Forces, trust that the government of the day will be doing everything in our best interest? What is the purpose of this?
So, where is the question of distrust? How does demanding a discussion in the apex legislative institution really translate into the paradigm of distrust? In fact, on the contrary, it seems that government is distrusting Parliament. And as I earlier pointed out, that the Indian Parliament, going all the way back to 1962, if not even earlier, has had a very, very healthy tradition when it comes to sensitivity on questions of national security. And I'm sure that people in government do have that wisdom to be able to tread that fine line between keeping Parliament informed and at the same time keeping to themselves what may be tactically or strategically vital information. Well, everybody in government, I think, should have that sagacity to be able to tread that fine line.
So let me now move to the other contentious issue in this session, and that has been about the independence of judiciary. Broadly speaking, the independence of judiciary, but a deeper fight seems to be going on between the executive and the judiciary over the Collegium system, over NJAC, etc. In the middle of this, we've had Mr. Jagdeep Dhankar, the Rajya Sabha chairman, lash out at Mrs. Sonia Gandhi for her comments that he was trying to delegitimize the judiciary. He has said, don't bring my office into this. How do you see this fight playing out?
Well, first of all, the statements which emanated from the government unfortunately did not really do anything to lessen the perception of tension between the executive and the judiciary. In fact, they seem to exacerbate it. For the law minister to say that the Supreme Court should not be hearing bail matters in frivolous public interest litigations, in fact, militates against the entire conception of liberty. It raises a fundamental question. Does this government believe in liberty? Does it believe in Article 21 of the Constitution of India? Is this government not aware that 77% of India's inmate population in prisons are under trials? And therefore, at a point in time when the Supreme Court, led by the Chief Justice, was actually trying to fast track issues of liberty by putting bail matters on priority. For the law minister to give this advice, if I may say, sounds a bit rich. And then, if coming to public interest litigations, I am amazed that the law minister is not aware of the fact that some of the finest jurisprudence in India, going back to the Bandhua Bhukti Morcha case, and then on to Godavarman, which laid down the ground rules of environmental jurisprudence, or even the Vishakha matter, which actually laid down guidelines how sexual harassment in workplaces has to be dealt with, or even the right to privacy, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, by a constitutional bench of the Supreme Court, with a 9-0 verdict. All of them came out of public interest litigations. And then when it comes to the question at if government has reservations with regard to the Collegium system, then why did it take them 470 days to file a review petition against that particular judgment, which was then dismissed because of delay and on merits? And subsequently, if government still continued to be unhappy, why did they not file a curative review petition? Why did they not bring a fresh bill before Parliament, which could have reconciled some of the criticisms which had been made when the NJAC was struck down for one by a bench of the Supreme Court? So therefore, it all kind of lends into a perception that government, for reasons best known to it, was trying to actually orchestrate a conflict with the judiciary.
You have been in government, Mr. Tiwari, and do you think that this conflict or the point that the law minister, the current law minister, is saying has merit? Because it has now become a matter of public debate. Should judges be allowed to choose who comes next themselves? Or should there be independent scrutiny? Should the government have any say? Was the NJAC completely flawed because it was passed by Parliament?
Well, if you look at our constitutional scheme, and I'm sure you would be aware of it, that the final arbiter of any legislation in terms of its constitutionality is the judiciary. That's how the legislative constitutional scheme is structured. And so, therefore, once Parliament had passed the NJAC and it was ratified by one half of the assemblies, it still lay in the domain of the judiciary to legislate on its or to pronounce on its constitutionality, which they did. And so, therefore, the NJAC is the law of the land, and under various articles of the Constitution, which govern the role of the Supreme Court in the scheme of things, if I remember correctly, Article 142 and 144 of the Constitution of India, everybody is mandated to follow the law laid down by the Supreme Court. So under those circumstances, to publicly start questioning the wisdom of what is now the law of the land without really trying to propose an alternative, I do not really understand what is the intent behind it. And that's why we wanted a larger discussion on the relationship between the executive and the judiciary.
But the belief is that there may be another form of the NJAC coming soon. The counter argument to what you've just said, Mr. Tiwari, is often that does Parliament that represents the will of the people have no right to make laws? Can the Supreme Court or can the courts strike it down if this is reflective of the will of the people? And secondly, do you think that there will be another NJAC, or is there a need to re-look at another form of the NJAC?
Of course, the Supreme Court can strike it down. The Supreme Court is well within its right to strike it down on the touchstone of constitutionality. And if I remember correctly from the top of my head, the NJAC was struck down primarily because the court in its wisdom felt that it impinged upon the basic structure of the Constitution. And as you are aware, that after the Kesavanand Bharati judgment in 1973, the basic structure of the Constitution is beyond the amending power of Parliament. So therefore, to even make this argument that the Supreme Court does not have the right to strike down a law which may have been unanimously passed by or near unanimously passed by Parliament and ratified by one half of the legislatures, really mocks our constitutional scheme and the jurisprudence which has been in place since 1973. And insofar as your question with regard to another NJAC is concerned, well, we'll have to wait and see as to what the government does, because it took the government 470 odd days to even file a review petition against the Supreme Court order with regard to striking down the NJAC. And that particular review petition was dismissed on grounds of delay and on merits, as I earlier mentioned, and the government chose not to file a curative review when that option was available to the government.
Let me talk a bit about COVID-19 and this new concern that is now evolving as cases are rising in neighboring China. There have been series of meetings at all levels, including the Prime Minister held a meeting on keeping our guard up. In the midst of this, a letter sent by the Health Minister on being COVID safe in the Bharat Jodo Yatra became a huge political issue. Mr. Tiwari, I want to understand what is wrong in asking people who are gathering in large numbers to be safe and to take precautions at a time when there are concerns about a huge outbreak in the neighboring country.
Well, the letter, if I can put it in those words, was very myopic and political to begin with. If you have concerns, which are legitimate concerns given the situation in China, the first thing that you should have done is put in place a system which screens all travelers who may be originating in China and are transiting through various destinations into India. First of all, you required to firewall yourself against the virus because going by past experiences, if Europe would have banned flights from China in time, especially to Milan, which is the de facto headquarters of the high fashion leather industry, possibly Europe would not have been that badly hit as it unfortunately did get hit in the March-April of 2020. So therefore, rather than taking all the other steps which are necessary, the first thing the health minister chooses to do is write a letter which whose intent is or was clearly political, for the lack of a better word. And I don't think that's how governance needs to be done.
Do you think the target is, as you're saying, Bharat Jodo Yatra? Because Mansukh Mandavia, the health minister, says it's his job. It's his job to, warn against and caution against large mass gatherings.
Well, it is his job to see that India is protected and insulated against the virus. And as I earlier pointed out, that the first step should have been to try and firewall the physical ingress of that virus, which may permeate into India through travel from overseas, rather than take the essential steps which needed to be taken in a certain sequence. If you suddenly, as a first step, have a letter addressed to a senior leader of the opposition, primarily aimed at trying to stop him in his tracks, then obviously the opposition is going to conclude that the whole intent behind this exercise is partisan and it is completely a subverted notion of what the priorities with regard to tackling the COVID situation, given the upsurge in cases in China and Brazil and South Korea and the United States of America, should be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Tiwari, for speaking with us, and we can hope for more coming out of the next Parliament session. This one seemed to be dominated by who said what to whom, and very little work.
Well, unfortunately, Tamanna, you raise a rather relevant point, because between 1952 and 1971, Parliament met on an average for about 122 days in a year. After 2000, that number has dropped to about 68 days a year. And I think this year we would not even perhaps clock 60 days. So, under those circumstances, there's a very big question as to why the time Parliament should be spending on debating issues before this country, scrutinizing legislation, is being consistently whittled down. And that's something the government will have to answer for.
Right. Thank you once again for your time, Mr. Tiwari.